Welcome to Psychodynamic Psychology. My name is Alina. I'm a German psychoanalyst in training, and I did the math. In 2024, I read over 4,200 pages, which were 25 pieces of literature, 19 books, 6 articles, and in this video, I want to share my top 10 reads of 2024. This year, I have dedicated a lot of my time to reading and a lot of my time to putting together everything I read. So what I will use to give you this recap of my top 10 reads of 2024 is my Psychodynamic library. It's a Notion database I built for myself where I track everything I ever read. Whenever I read on my Kindle, I export my notes as much as the publisher lets me. So if you want to browse through everything I ever read, look at my notes. This is a really good resource. You can get the link if you sign up for my email list. So the link is below and then you can just follow along. Every single one of the 25 pieces of literature I read this year is rated. I rate on a scale from 0 to 10. I'm usually pretty generous. I think a lot of my books get a 9, 8, or 7. And this year, there was no book that got a 10 out of 10. Actually, there's only one book that I ever gave a 10 out of 10. If you want to know what that is, I'm going to make another video on my favorite psychodynamic book I ever read. But today I will share with you all the books that got either a 9 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10. And yeah, those are going to be the 10 picks of 2024. So there's 8 pieces of literature that got an 8 out of 10, and there are 2 books that got a 9 out of 10. So the order I present them in is not from my least favorite to my most favorite, but all the 8 pieces of literature that got 8 out of 8, I'll lump together, and then we have the 2 books that got a 9 out of 10 rating. But let's start with the first book that made it into my top 10. It got an 8 out of 10 rating, and that was Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy, A Practitioner's Guide by Nancy McWilliams. It was published in 2004 and has over 350 pages. I already mentioned this book in my last video where I talked about everything I read in October, November 2024. Well, it was not one of the books I read back then, but I read Alessandra Lemma's book, which was also an introduction to psychoanalytic psychotherapy. And I said that, I kind of enjoyed Nancy McWilliams' book more. And that's why it is in my top 10. I mean, Nancy McWilliams, she is one of my favorite writers. Everything she writes is both beginner friendly, but also suitable for more advanced readers. And her Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy, A Practitioner's Guide, is just one of those books. In her book, Nancy McWilliams really takes you along through everything that is important in psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So she talks about what is the psychoanalytic sensibility, values like curiosity, awe, complexity, identification, empathy, attachment, and so on. She talks about the preparation that needs to happen both for the therapist and for the client. Then she talks about boundaries, which are incredibly important, both the boundaries about the frame and boundaries when it comes to, gift giving, enactments. How can you disclose, or should you disclose, private things about you if you are a psychoanalytic psychotherapist? She talks about basic therapy processes such as listening, talking, and then she also includes 2 case studies, which are very interesting. Plus, in the end, what I really enjoyed was a chapter on self-care for you as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, a practitioner, and how you can take care of your id, of your ego, and your superego. So that was very cute. I really enjoyed that. So if you are a beginning practitioner and you're looking for a good introduction to psychoanalytic psychotherapy, this is a very solid one. The next 2 pieces of literature that both also got an 8 out of 10 from me, and I'm kind of lumping them together because they're both by the same author. One is a book, the other is an article, and the author is Mark Solms, and you might have seen the video I did about his book, The Hidden Spring. You can find it on my channel if you're interested in learning more about the neuropsychology of dreams. The Hidden Spring is about much more than that, but this is, if you enjoy this, then it might be a good sign for you to get the entire book. Anyway, Mark Solms published The Hidden Spring in 2021. So I think this is the most recent, the most modern book I've ever read this year. It has over 420 pages. Again, I talked about this book at length in the specific separate YouTube video. I'm going to link that below in case that's interesting to you. But The Hidden Spring by Mark Solms, it's a very technical, it's a very scientific book, so it's not an easy read. But Mark Solms combines two areas, one of them being psychoanalysis. He is a trained psychoanalyst, and neuroscience, because he's also a neuroscientist. And he combined those into a new field, which he called neuropsychoanalysis. Super interesting. If this is something that strikes your fancy, you can read The Hidden Spring. You can type in Mark Solms on YouTube. He has some wonderful interviews. He's such a calm, knowledgeable person. It's really enjoyable to listen to him. In his book, he tackles multiple avenues where neuroscience and psychoanalysis meet. He starts off with the neuropsychology of dreams. He discovered the mechanism behind why we dream, what is happening in our brains, where it comes from. Very, very interesting. And then he spends a lot of his book trying to understand where consciousness comes from. What is the hidden spring of consciousness? And he finds that it's not in the frontal cortex, as we long thought, where it's all about logic and reasoning, but actually that consciousness arises from the brainstem, and it all has to do with us feeling feelings, because feeling feelings is what signals whether our needs are met. It's very interesting, but be prepared that it's technical. You will probably have to have Wikipedia or something else open to ask questions or look things up. At least that's what I had to do, but I can recommend it. It made it into my top 10. The other paper from Mark Solms that made it into my top 10, and I connect the two because they have a lot to do with each other, is an article that he wrote in 2018 called The Neuroscientific Underpinnings of Psychoanalysis. It's an article that is freely available. I'm going to link it below as well, so you can read it for yourself. It's a very interesting paper where Mark Solms tries to set out the neurobiological underpinnings of certain claims, theoretical foundations of psychoanalysis. For example, that we have innate emotional needs, that we learn from experience, and that there is something such as unconscious mental processing. Really recommend that. I'm going to link it below. You should be able to read it for free and have access to it, and you can judge for yourself what you think about it. Next, one of the two books I read in paper version. If you've been around on this channel before, you will have seen this book. It is, again, The Shadow of the Object by Christopher Bollas. I've shown this book a couple of times because it really impressed me. Bollas is such an innovative thinker. To give you a reference what modern and innovative means in psychoanalysis, this was published in 1987. It has over 220 pages, so it's not a monstrous read like some other books. But yeah, Christopher Bollas, he's so fascinating. I ordered a few more books of his that hopefully arrive in the next couple of days. So in the new year, I might have some more books of his that I can review and see if I recommend them to you or not. But yeah, The Shadow of the Object is a collection of essays named after his famous essay, The Shadow of the Object. And yeah, he introduces so many new interesting concepts. You could make a video about every one of his concepts because they're so interesting and so novel. For example, just to give you some ideas of what he's talking about. The first is the transformational object, the trisexual, normotic illness, extractive introjection. It's so interesting. It's so rich, so innovative. When did I read this book? Yeah, I read this book in July. And when I read it in July, I said that this is kind of a litmus test of if you really enjoy psychodynamics, because if you give this book to anyone who doesn't really enjoy psychodynamics or the psychoanalytic way of thinking, conceptualizing things, they're going to hate this book. It's not going to be for them. But if you are someone who's very curious about diving into psychoanalytic thinking, into psychodynamics, this is really something that is going to tickle your fancy and is really going to challenge you. Do I agree with everything he says? No. Do I think some concepts are a bit too weird and not really my cup of tea? Yes. But still, it's so rewarding to follow such an innovative and clear and attentive thinker in coming up with new theories, but I don't know if that would be the right way to say it. Uncovering new theories, I don't know. Anyway, I really enjoyed it. And if you are a psychodynamic nerd like me, this is something I can recommend to put on your reading list for the next year. The next book I rated 8 out of 10 was also one of the books I read in actual print. You probably already seen this before as well, and this is, if it's focusing all right, Psychoanalytic Studies of the Personality by W.R.D. Fairbairn. If you've heard me talk about this before, I'm sorry, but just to quickly repeat, I discovered Fairbairn mostly because I read a paper by Thomas Ogden, another modern, very innovative thinker, and he recommended one of Fairbairn's papers, which caused me to buy this book, and it was fantastic. Fairbairn, not beginner friendly, very complex. I will need to read this book again and study it up close, but it is absolutely worth the read. Fairbairn, he belongs to the object relational group, and he describes his very own, which he called like an endopsychic structure, how self and object relations come to be, how we can understand an internal saboteur, why people cling to bad objects, to bad people. It's very interesting. I can recommend it, and I hope as soon as I understand and study him more that I will be able to explain and share more of his very interesting takes and very unique perspective on this channel. As you can see, this is not a fast read. It has, 336 pages. And if you're curious to dive into this, Fairbairn, or like, this was not published by Fairbairn, it was published by one of his students, I think, and his granddaughter. I'm not entirely sure, I forgot who the other publisher was. But anyways, this book is split into parts. Part 1 is an object relations theory of the personality. This is really an in-depth development of his psychoanalytic theory, so you can really follow his train of thought. The paper that is the most famous one is the 4th paper. It's called Endopsychic Structure Considered in Terms of Object Relationships. If all you want to do is read that one, I'm sure you can find it on the internet or in a shorter form somewhere. But that is part 1. Part 2 is his clinical papers, and part 3 is miscellaneous papers. I thought, it's really sufficient to only read part 1. That was really the most interesting. And the other is more if you're just really, really interested to understand the entire development of his theories and everything he had written. But for most of you, part 1 should be enough to cover. In addition to that, another article that made it into my top 10 is Why Read Fairbairn by Thomas Ogden. And Thomas Ogden puts together a very lovely perspective of why Fairbairn still matters and what we can get from his theories. Really enjoyed that. If you're looking to start reading Fairbairn and the original Fairbairn might be a bit too dense or too complicated, you can start with a paper of Thomas Ogden. Thomas Ogden is not really an easy read, but sometimes getting that secondary perspective before you dive into the real main thing can be very helpful. So that was another article that I was really happy with, 8 out of 10. The next book that got an 8 out of 10 was mentioned in my last video where I talked about the books I read in October and November 2024, and that is the biography of Karen Horney. It is called A Mind of Her Own, The Life of Karen Horney by Susan Quinn. I've said before, I love reading biographies. It gives you a very solid understanding of where the specific psychodynamic thinker, in this case Karen Horney, came from and what made her develop exactly the theories that she did. I'm currently still reading Sigmund Freud's biography, although I need to put that away every now and then because it's too many pages. I read the biography of Heinz Kohut, and I'm looking to add a few others for example, the biography of Melanie Klein. I'm still looking for a good read on that. But yeah, this biography of Karen Horney was published in 1987. It has 480 pages, and Susan Quinn just did a beautiful job. She really paints the picture of what it was like to be a woman at the turn of the century. Karen Horney was one of the first women in Germany that attended gymnasium. She was one of the first women in Germany that attended university, became a medical student, and yeah, it's been a joy to read. I really enjoyed it. And especially if you want to dive into Karen Horney's theories, I plan to put a paid workshop together where I share everything I learned from reading all her books and studying her in depth. But if you want to really study her, read everything she read, I think this biography is a wonderful place to start to get a sense of what her life was like, because the life always influences the theory. The next book that got an 8 out of 10 rating in this year was a book by Karen Horney herself. I've read so much of what she wrote. Self-analysis, the neurotic personality of our time, our inner conflicts, all of that. Neurosis and human growth, of course, her most mature theory. But there was another book I didn't know existed, and it is called New Ways in Psychoanalysis. I also read that on my Kindle, so if you sign up to my email newsletter, you can get my notes on this one if it's interesting to you. So New Ways in Psychoanalysis by Karen Horney was published in 1937. It has a bit over 300 pages, and this is a very special book. I loved the format. I wish every theorist would have at least one book that is formatted like that. Because what Karen Horney did was she took every single one of Freud's major concepts, such as libido theory, Oedipus complex, narcissism, feminine psychology, death instinct, the ego and the id, transference, the superego. She took, and so many more, she took those individual concepts, first laid out what she understands Freud meant by that, and then she gave her own take. And I thought that was brilliant. It was so nice, because I know that many people wonder, well, how does Karen Horney compare to Freud? What is the difference between the two? And the answer is this book. Like, Karen Horney spelled it out herself. She took all the Freudian concepts and gave her own take on them, which is, again, absolutely brilliant. I wish every other thinker would have done this work, because now we all got to go back, piece together their theory compared to Freud's and, do our own comparison. But Karen Horney did that for us. Especially, again, as I said, if you're interested in really understanding Karen Horney's theory and you want to know exactly how she differs from Freud, she wrote the answers herself in New Ways in Psychoanalysis. Okay, so this brings us to the last two books. The last two books that made it into my top 10, and not just made it to my top 10, but actually are at the top of my top 10. Two books that got a 9 out of 10 rating from me. And the first one of those is going to be a bit disappointing to my English-speaking audience, because it's a German book and I couldn't find any English translation, which is such a pity because it's so good. I wish everyone had access to this book. If ever there will be a translation, I will let you know. But so far, it looks like it's only available in German, because it's also by a German author. It's called Triangulierung by Jürgen Grieser. So it's about triangulation. It was published in 2015 and it only has 140 pages roughly. The good thing is, this book is part of a series that is published in German, where certain thinkers, certain authors are invited to write very short books on a very specific topic. And just like other authors in this series who wrote about the unconscious or guilt or shame, Jürgen Grieser, he wrote a big book on triangulation, understanding everything that has to do with triangulation. I haven't got my hands on that book yet. Maybe one day I will. But he condensed everything he knows about triangulation into, 140 pages. And they're really, really good. It's not often that I read something where I want to highlight almost every sentence just because it's so good and it's so dense and there's no fluff, just pure substance. And it really made me fall in love with the concept of triangulation. After I read this book, I wanted to learn so much more about it. I was absolutely fascinated. So far, I haven't read too many good books that expand on this or add new points of views to the topic of triangulation. But this was definitely a 9 out of 10. Such a good book. If you are German speaking, please get it. It's very cheap as well. It's only 140 pages and you will learn a lot. So this is definitely time well spent. I'm going to also link that below. And yeah, if anyone wants to translate it, I don't know how that works. But yeah, if you speak German, get this book. If you're a psychodynamic practitioner, you will not regret it. And that brings me to the last book that made it into my top 10 in 2024. It's a book that also got a 9 out of 10, and it's a beginner-friendly book, which is amazing. And that is Schopenhauer's Porcupines, Intimacy and Its Dilemmas by Deborah Luepnitz. It's published in 2002, has 290 pages, and I think this was the book in 2024 that I couldn't put down. I mean, usually, when I read psychodynamic literature, like this, like Fairbairn or like Bollas, it's very enjoyable. I love it, but I can only read that much because then, I need to digest it and then I need to take time to understand it. But Deborah Luepnitz did something that I didn't think was possible. She made a psychodynamic book that was just so enjoyable, so captivating that I really couldn't put it down. I think I read this book in 2 days because it was just so engaging. And the thing is that this is not a theory-heavy book. This is a book about case studies. Deborah Luepnitz is a highly accomplished, very experienced psychoanalyst. And in this book, Deborah Luepnitz takes you through 5 case studies. So if you are a beginning psychoanalytic practitioner, it is wonderful to learn from those case studies because it gives you a peek into what it means to be a practitioner, because usually we don't get that. I don't think there's any psychoanalyst that would accept a student, sitting in the consulting room while they give therapy. So all we really have are those case studies, and Deborah Luepnitz just does a fantastic job. I enjoyed this book so much. All of the stories are so captivating, so moving, and every now and then, you kind of have to shed a tear because it's very, very touching. And at the same time, every now and then she sprinkles a little bit of theory in there. So yeah, this is all around a fantastic book. I can really recommend it. Right now in my book club, we're reading Love's Executioner by Jürgen. Also fantastic case studies. But Yalom, he can be a bit extreme in the one or the other case. And all in all, I would say that Deborah Luepnitz's book has been more enjoyable for me personally. So that is it. Those were my top 10 books. I selected the best of the 4,200 plus pages I read for you. I hope this was enjoyable. Thank you so much for sticking around for 2024 with me. If you've been on my email list this year, you will have heard a bit more from me. If you've only been on my YouTube channel, I made myself a bit scarce on here. Anyways, I hope to be publishing more in 2024, focusing on my love for those psychodynamic concepts and theories. I'm very much looking forward to seeing you then. Take care. Bye-bye.